Recording. Okay, so again, there's no video recorded and there's no quick Q&A after the study recorded. So your anonymity is safe. For those of you who might be new, my name is Peter Misson. I am a recovered alcoholic. My sober date is 11th of December 1981, which is next Sunday, which is amazing. And I don't know if I've actually lasted this long. And I was sponsored into doing this by my grand sponsor, Cliff Bishop of Dallas, Texas. And as he got older, I was hosting for him on Skype, of all things, a long time ago. And as he got older and more infirm, he started to hand it over to me. And eventually he said, "It's all yours." So here I am. And that was like easily 10 years ago. So I've been doing it ever since. So I always start off with a prayer, and the prayer is the lay-aside prayer. And the lay-aside prayer goes like this. God, please help us lay aside everything we think we know about ourselves, our alcoholism, our powerlessness, and our unmanageability. About this book and these steps, but most of all about you, God. We ask for an open mind and a new experience in all of these things. Please help us see truth. And we are on page XVI in the forward to the second edition, which is the second page of the forward to the second edition. Did the title page and the beginning of this. Now, what I'm going to do now for everyone, now everybody's here, is I'm going to paste a link to a Google Drive folder that's in the chat now, a link to the Google Drive folder that all the recordings will be put in that folder. So tonight's recording will be in there about an hour after we finish. And you can share that with anybody you wish. Plus, it means that you can go back over it and if you missed anything or whatever. So I do that. Okay. So when we look at page XVI, it's in the forward to the second edition. The forward to the second edition is pretty much a short history of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm going to just do a recap over the from the beginning of this bit. Actually, on the previous page, which is the first page of the forward to the second edition, the last paragraph, it says the spark was to flare into the first AA group was struck in Akron, Ohio, on June 10th, 1935, during a talk between the New York stockbroker Bill Wilson, an Akron physician, which is Dr. Robert Holbrook Smith, Dr. Bob. 6 months earlier, the broker had been relieved of his drink obsession by a sudden spiritual experience following a meeting with an alcoholic friend, a guy called Edwin Thatcher, known as Ebby Thatcher, a childhood friend of, well, certainly a teenage friend of Bill's, and a well-known drunk. I mean, even when he was a teenager, he was known for his drinking. So he'd been in contact with the Oxford groups of that day. Now I'm gonna talk a little bit about the Oxford groups at the end of this paragraph. He had also been greatly helped by the late Dr. William D. Silkworth, a New York specialist in alcoholism. Now, when we get to the doctor's opinion, we'll talk more about Dr. Silkworth, but actually Dr. Silkworth was a world, he was like the most experienced doctor in the world treating alcoholics at the time, who is now accounted no less than a medical saint by AA members, and whose story of the early days of our society appears in the next pages in the doctor's opinion. From this doctor, the broker had learned the grave nature of alcoholism. And the grave nature of alcoholism is that it's a physical allergic reaction to alcohol. that we metabolize alcohol differently from other people. That's what makes us alcoholic. That once we drink, we can't control how much we drink because of this allergic reaction. But I'll talk more about that in the doctor's opinion. Okay, though he could not accept all the tenets of the Oxford group. Now, the Oxford groups are very interesting. The Oxford groups were a a Christian organization that was started by a Methodist minister or a Methodist preacher. I don't even think he was a minister. And it had its roots in the UK, actually. He was American, but it had the roots in the UK. And it's called the Oxford Groups because it was originally called First Century Christianity. That's what the founder of the thing, Frank Bookman, called it. But it was adopted as being the Oxford Groups when they visited South Africa as a group to try and carry the message of their way of their brand of spirituality, or their brand of Christianity to South Africa. And on all of their luggage, somebody had written Oxford Group. Most of the people there were graduates from Oxford or students at Oxford. And that just caught on. So they were known as the Oxford Group, not the Oxford Movement. That is something different. There is an Oxford Movement, but that's different. But what these people did, they did away with all the doctrine and all the stuff, and they brought it down to its bare bones. And what they did is in the big book. And if we go to the back of the book, there's a story in the back of the book called He Sold Himself Short. And He Sold Himself Short is a story about a guy called Earl T. And now Earl T shows up in the main part of the book as well. And Earl was brought Alcoholics Anonymous to Chicago. And if we look at page 263 in the fourth edition of Alcoholics Anonymous, or actually it starts, I keep on doing this, it starts on the previous page. Right at the bottom of page 262, it says, the day before I was due to go back to Chicago, it was Dr. Bob's afternoon off. He had me to the office, and we spent 3 or 4 hours formally going through the 6-step program as it was at that time. Now, that's not correct. What the Oxford Group did were not steps as we understand steps. They were things that the Oxford Group did, and it was passed on by word of mouth. Now, it sounds like Dr. Bob took this guy through these 6 things in an afternoon. But Earl had been living with him for 2 months. And Dr. Bob had been instructing him all the time that he was there. This is formally going through it before he leaves to make sure that he's got it so that he can pass it on to somebody else. And it goes like this. Complete deflation. That is the second half of our first step. My life is so it wasn't really unmanageable, but it was like my life is not complete without God in it. But we've got to have 3 steps for that. We can't, because most of these people that were in the Oxford Group were already church people. There was big in the Episcopalian Church in the United States and in the Church of England in the UK. So it was kind of high church, but that was the sort of places where these people were. We come from this, but we've changed it so much. But we do come from this. Then it says dependence and guidance from a higher power. Well, that would be the 3rd step. It would be the 7th step, or the 6th step and the 7th step, and it would be step 10, and 11. You see how Bill's broken it down and made it much, much broader, much, much easier for us alcoholics to understand. Moral inventory, well, that's our 4th step. They call it confession in the Oxford Group, and that's the 5th step. And I'm a Catholic. I know about confession. It's nothing like confession. 5th step is not confession, folks. I tried it. I tried to dodge my first sponsor and go to confession and instead telling him my 4th step, and that didn't work. And as soon as I'd done it, I knew it wasn't working. So I had to phone him up and I say, Billy, I got to come and do a 5th step. And he said, okay, I'm there. Then restitution, which is our step 8 and 9, and then continued work with others. It doesn't say alcoholics in the Oxford group because the Oxford group did not like the alcoholics. It just happened that the alcoholics got sober in the Oxford group by doing what the Oxford group did, but they were not liked because they were not sort of particularly moral people, and they were not sort of upstanding citizens. And the idea of the Oxford group was to change the world. They were going to change the world. Frank Bookman went around the world meeting leaders of countries, trying to convert them to his form of Christianity. And if he said everybody did that, then the world would be a wonderful place and there would be no wars and all this kind of stuff. He even went to Berlin 3 times in the 1930s to try and talk to Hitler to avoid the Second World War. That's how powerful Frank Bookman thought he was. The problem was that the last time he was going to go to Berlin, he was interviewed by the National Broadcasting Corporation of America. And during that interview, he said, if I could convert Hitler, we could avoid the Second World War. And I would say, thank God for Hitler. And the New York Times the next morning had a banner headline that says, Frank Bookman says, thank God for Hitler. And that was the end of the Oxford group. It disappeared almost overnight. Within a few months, it was changed its name to no, it's gone from me. But they changed their name. However, and that was the end of that. But we carry on looking at what they did, and Bill did what they did, but in order to pass it on to other people or to alcoholics, Bill had this inspiration to make the 12 steps out of what the Oxford group did, but also de-religiousize it. That we have a spiritual way of life here, not a religious one. Okay, so Bill said he was convinced of the need, so we're about a third of the way down page 26 in the Roman numerals XVI. He was convinced of the need for moral inventory, which is our 5th step, confession of personal defects, 4th step, confession of personal defects, 5th step, restitution to those harmed, 8 and 9, helpfulness to others, and the necessity and belief in and dependence upon God, which is step 4, 7, 10, 11. Prior to his journey to Akron, the broker had worked hard with many alcoholics on the theory that only an alcoholic can help an alcoholic. But he had succeeded only in keeping himself sober. And just before he was due to leave, he had an argument with Lois, his wife. And he said, I'm going to stop doing this. And she said, no, you're not, because you're staying sober and I like you sober. And he also went to see Dr. Silkworth. And he said to Dr. Silkworth, he said, I don't know what's going on here. Nobody seems to be taking and nobody seems to be getting what I got. And I said, I keep on trying, and I keep on trying to tell them what I've got and all this kind of stuff, and they don't seem to want it. And Silkworth said to him, what are you telling them? And Bill says, I'm telling them about my spiritual experience. And he said, but haven't you told them what I told you about alcoholism? And in Bill's story, we'll see that. And the second time he'd gone to Towns Hospital, he went there 3 times. The second time, Dr. Silkworth told him that he was a hopeless alcoholic and he was going to die or go insane unless he had an entire psychic change. But he never told these people in the hospital about the grave nature of alcoholism. But Bill knew that before Ebby showed up. And so he said, so Dr. Silkworth said to him, you got the cart before the horse. You must tell them what alcoholism is first, and then tell them about the solution that you found. Because if you do that and they realize that they're hopeless, because alcoholism is a hopeless progressive disease or an illness, we call it an illness, we don't call it a disease, that that once they know that it's a hopeless condition of mind and body, then they are more likely to follow the spiritual path that you've been on and that has worked for you. And he went to Akron with that in mind. So prior to his journey to Akron, the broker had worked with many alcoholics on the theory that only an alcoholic can help an alcoholic, but he had succeeded only in keeping himself sober. The broker had gone to Akron on a business venture which had collapsed, leaving him greatly in fear that he might start drinking again. And he almost did. It was seconds and inches, and we'll get to that again later on in the book. He suddenly realized, before going in to have a drink, because he thought he could get away with 2 or 3, in order to save himself, he must carry the message to another alcoholic. That alcoholic turned out to be the Akron physician. Prior to the meeting with Dr. Bob, Bill Wilson was the only person in the whole world that had the 2 pieces that we use in Alcoholics Anonymous today. He had the doctor's opinion about our allergic reaction to alcohol and about our mind that takes us back to drinking. And he had the spiritual solution to alcoholism. So he had the 2 pieces. And he was on a Friday night in Akron, after he was broke. This business adventure had collapsed. All his backers from New York had left. He couldn't pay his hotel bill. And he's walking up and down in the lobby going, oh, I can see the folks in the bar. They're having a great time. I wonder if I could go in there and just have a couple of drinks. And he nearly did. And if he had, we wouldn't be here. That's how close it gets. And all the way through, it gets this close. All the way through. If Ebby Thatcher had got drunk one more time before going to see Bill, we wouldn't be here. You know, if Roland Hazard didn't go to, which we'll see again later on, Roland Hazard didn't go to Switzerland, we wouldn't be here. There's all sorts of stuff like that, you know, all the way through the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's like, okay, well, it's kind of like a mysterious path that we just get bounced over here, and then somebody gets bounced over here and somebody there, and it all comes together in Bill. So the alcoholic turned out to be the Akron physician, Dr. Bob. The physician had repeatedly tried spiritual means to resolve his alcoholic dilemma, but had failed. And he'd been in the Oxford group 2 years longer than Bill, but he kept on drinking. Bill had stopped drinking when he did what the Oxford group said. Dr. Bob was trying to do that while he was drinking. You know, in order to get sober, you've got to stop drinking. Even if it's for one day, you've got to stop drinking. But when the broker gave him Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and its hopelessness, the physician began to pursue the spiritual remedy of his malady with a willingness he'd never before been able to muster. And that's the secret. Kill a case of alcoholism on a 12-step course. That's what my first sponsor did with me. Billy Faulkner, he came along and he told me about his drinking and about how bad it was. And it matched my drinking and how bad it was. And he started to call himself an alcoholic. He didn't call me one. But I said to him, you're calling yourself an alcoholic. I drink exactly the same way. I have exactly the same problem with controlling my drinking as you got. So I must be an alcoholic too. And he said, that's great. He said, well, the great thing about that is that in Alcoholics Anonymous, we have a solution for it. And then he started to teach me about 12 steps. He sobered never to drink again that moment of his death in 1950. This seemed to prove that one alcoholic could affect another as no non-alcoholic could, because this is where the singleness of purpose comes in. Alcoholics Anonymous has singleness of purpose. It's one alcoholic talking to another alcoholic, getting identification from the sober alcoholic and being given the message of hope in the 12 steps that we can recover from alcoholism. That first part on the title page of Alcoholics Anonymous where it says the story of many thousands of men and women have recovered from alcoholism. We won't always be recovering. We'll be recovering while we work through the 12 steps. But if we start to live in those 12 steps, particularly in steps 10, 11, and 12, we get to a place called recovered. Conditional on doing our amends and it's a daily reprieve, but the disciplines of 10 and 11 are something that we carry along with us, and it becomes a way of life. So at the top of page XVII, it says, it also indicated that strenuous work, one alcoholic with another, was vital to permanent recovery. And vital means life-giving or life-preserving or necessary for life. Well, if I'm going to die of alcoholism, then I need life. And I need these 12 steps in order to survive alcoholism. Hence, the two men set to work almost frantically upon alcoholics arriving at the ward of the Akron City Hospital. Their very first case, a guy called Bill D., a desperate one, recovered immediately. His story is the story immediately after Dr. Bob's nightmare in the Big Book, and became AA number 3. He had never had another drink. This work in Akron continued through the summer of 1935. And it continued because Bill couldn't go, because Bill was in a court case and he had to go to court every week or so. There were many failures, but there was an occasional heartening success. When the broker returned to New York in the fall of 1935, the first AA group had actually been formed, though no one realized it at the time, because they were still part of the Oxford group and they weren't Alcoholics Anonymous yet. Though some of them call themselves anonymous alcoholics in the Oxford group, or the alcoholic squad of the Oxford group in various parts. But they were not liked. They tended to be shunned by normal members of the Oxford group. A second small group promptly took shape in New York, to be followed in 1937, the start of a third in Cleveland, which is close to Akron. Besides these, there were scattered alcoholics who had picked up our basic ideas in Akron or New York, were trying to form groups in other cities. By late 1937, the number of members having substantial sobriety behind them, I love that. 1935, and they got substantial 1937, 2 years, they have substantial sobriety. Why? Because they were all hopeless alcoholics and they couldn't stay sober 2 days, let alone 2 years. Was sufficient to convince the membership that a new light had entered the dark world of alcoholism. It was now time, the struggling groups thought, to place their message and unique experience before the world. In the meantime, Bill had some big plans for Alcoholics Anonymous. They were going to have hospitals, and they were going to have missionaries, and the missionaries would be paid, and Bill would be the head missionary, and it was going to be might have probably been called the Wilson Movement or whatever, and all that got shut down. And they ended up just having the book, which was great. I mean, that was the group conscience, actually, which is good conscience at work is a wonderful thing. And somebody once said a long time ago, if Bill Wilson had been the sole founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, then Alcoholics Anonymous would have been franchised like McDonald's. But if Dr. Bob had been the sole founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, it would never have got out of Akron. So between the two of them, they were Dr. Bob was the anchor. Bill was the brains, but Dr. Bob was the anchor. And the last words that Dr. Bob said to Bill before he died was, "Let's keep this simple, Bill." So the struggling groups thought to place their message and the unique experience before the world. This determination bore fruit in the spring of 1939 by the publication of this volume. The membership had then reached about 100 men and women. There was about 45 of them when they started writing the book. The fledgling society, which had been nameless, other than the Alcoholic Squad of the Oxford Group, or nameless alcoholics in alcoholics in the Oxford Group. However, one of the gentlemen that would bill 12-step when he first got back to New York from Akron, Hank P., he had an idea for the book, and he made a plan for the book. And very, very early on, one of the titles that he came across was Alcoholics Anonymous, or Anonymous Alcoholics. So the fledgling society, which had been nameless, now began to be called Alcoholics Anonymous from the title of its own book. And the story goes that the first meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous were in Cleveland, Ohio, in late 1939 or maybe 1940, because the membership there was mostly Catholic, and the Oxford Group was a Protestant organization, and they got a letter from the bishop that says you can't be members of a Protestant organization, otherwise you get excommunicated. And they didn't want to get excommunicated from the Catholic Church, so they left, and they said, well, we're all going to get drunk. And they said, well, let's just carry on the meetings. Let's call ourselves something different. And so let's call ourselves after the big book. And they did. The flying blind period ended. Yep, because we've now got a textbook. We've got a book that shows us what the early members of Alcoholics Anonymous did in order to get sober. And AA entered a new phase of pioneering time. With the appearance of the new book, a great deal began to happen. Dr. Henry Emerson Fosdick, the noted clergyman, this guy could preach to football stadiums full of people. He was the Billy Graham. I know some folks, if you're old enough, remember Billy Graham floating around Europe in the 1960s. He used to fill up football stadiums as well. And this guy was the same. Reviewed it with approval. So here's a very famous preacher saying, yep, this is great. In the fall of 1939, this book came out in April 1939. In the fall of 1939, Fulton Ausler, the editor of Liberty, printed a piece of his magazine called Alcoholics and God. This brought in a rush of 800 frantic inquiries into the little New York office, which had meanwhile been established. Now, this guy, Fulton Ausler, is very interesting because his wife was a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. His wife was called Grace. And on the 31st of March, 1947, in the Dorchester Hotel, I can't remember the room number, which was her room in the Dorchester Hotel. She'd come to London. The first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, official meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, was in the Dorchester Hotel on the 31st of March, and there were 7 people at the meeting. And she officially brought AA to the UK. There had been a few members of Alcoholics Anonymous from the United States in England during the beginning of the Second World War. One of them was a lady journalist who had tried to carry the message to some folks in London, but was sent back to the United States before the end of the war for some reason. But she reported from London to the United States. So we owe Grace a debt of gratitude. I was born in August 1947, so that by the time I got to be a hopeless alcoholic, Alcoholics Anonymous was well established in the UK, and there were experienced members of Alcoholics Anonymous there for me when I arrived 34 years later. Each inquiry was painstakingly answered, first by Ruth Hock, and then by Bobby B, and a few other people who we owe a great deal of debt to them. Sometimes Ruth Hock wasn't an alcoholic, but Bobby was, and they wrote letters and they sent out stuff, and most of the certainly with Ruth Hock, most of the letters that she sent out were actually handwritten. Pamphlets and books were sent out. Businessmen traveling out of the existing groups were referred to these prospective newcomers. New groups started up, and it was found, to the astonishment of everyone, except, of course, the people who wrote the book, that AA message could be transmitted in the mail as well as by word of mouth. That's the whole point of the big book. Follow the directions in the big book, get a spiritual awakening sufficient to overcome alcoholism. It sounds simple. It takes some work, but that's okay. By the end of 1939, it estimated that 800 alcoholics were on their way to recovery. In the spring of 1940, John D. Rockefeller Jr. gave a dinner for many of his friends, to which he invited AA members to tell their stories. And that's almost like an Oxford group meeting. An Oxford group meeting used to do that. They used to invite people who had been changed by what they did to people that, and they sat one member to 3 or 4 people on a table and around various tables. And that's how this thing was set up. But the Rockefeller Foundation had been involved with Alcoholics Anonymous for several years before this. And all of his friends, of course, were millionaires and multimillionaires. And Bill went to this dinner thinking that they're going to walk out with loads of money. And the problem was, John D. Rockefeller wasn't there, but he left a letter that said that money would hurt this, and so we wish them well, but we don't think that they need any money, that they could be self-supporting through their own contributions. And Bill said he saw $10 million walk out the door. He was a bit miffed by that, but in the end, we found out that we need to be poor. It's a very, very good thing for us. But the big deal about it was that the news got onto the world wires, and inquiries poured in again, and many people went to the bookstores to get the book Alcoholics Anonymous. Up until that time, they had problems selling it because it was big, it was expensive. It was the equivalent of $50 or more now. That was in 2012. So more now, maybe $55, $56. That's a lot of money at that time. By March 1941, the membership had shot up to 2,000. So we started off with 100, and now we're 2,000 by March 1941. See, we didn't grow rapidly in the early days. We grew very slowly in the early days. Then the big deal happened. This guy, Jack Alexander, wrote a feature article in the Saturday Evening Post. And this guy was an investigative journalist, and he'd just busted a racket on the New York docks, that the mafia were running protection racket on the New York docks and getting involved in the unions there and all sorts of stuff. And there was all sorts of jiggery-pokery going on. People ended up in the Hudson River in cement trousers and all this kind of stuff. And he went in there and exploded the lot. And he just wrote about it in the Saturday Evening Post. And then his editor said to him, he said, you know, there's this bunch of drunks downtown in New York, and they're trying to get money out of the Rockefeller Foundation. You've got to go and check this out because it looks like a scam. And he went and he checked it out, and he checked out Bill, and he went to Akron, and he talked to Dr. Bob, and he spoke to members of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he was so impressed by what he heard and saw that he wrote this amazing article in the Saturday Evening Post, which is still available as a pamphlet in Alcoholics Anonymous, and placed such a compelling picture of the AA before the general public. Alcoholics in Need really deluged us. By the close of 1941, AA numbered 8,000 members. So just in 1 year, we've kind of quadrupled. The mushrooming process was in full swing, and AA had become a national institution. Our society then entered a fearsome and exciting adolescent period. You can just imagine there's a whole bunch of people out there, all alcoholics, egos the size of a small planet, all trying to run the show. And we nearly disappeared again. The test that it faced was this. Could these large members of erstwhile erratic alcoholics, yeah, we are, we lack discipline, successfully meet and work together? Would there be quarrels over membership, leadership, and money? Would there be strivings for power and prestige? Oh, you bet there were. Would there be schisms which would split AA apart? Oh, yes, many places. There's lots of people walked out. There's lots of people started new groups. There's a couple of people that started a new fellowship. One guy in particular started All Addictions Anonymous. Still going, but it's not particularly strong. But that's what sort of happened, because he was fed up with Bill. He was fed up with what he called Bill's shenanigans. And he was going to make original AA. But it didn't turn out that way. But out of this frightening and first disrupting experience, the conviction grew that AAs had to hang together or die separately. We had to unify our fellowship or pass off the scene. Now, just before, around about this time, Earl T, that we've talked about before, showed up from Chicago in New York and said to Bill, he said, AA is falling apart. We've got to do something, otherwise we're going to go the way of the Washingtonians. And Bill said, who the heck are the Washingtonians? The Washingtonians were a group of drunks in Baltimore that decided on Washington's birthday that they were going to quit drinking and they were going to help each other to remain sober. So they had a fellowship, and they called themselves the Washingtonians, and that they would keep each other sober. And this idea got bigger and bigger, and it got out of town, and it got to other towns, and so forth and so on. But they didn't have any spiritual principles or whatever. It was purely fellowship. But then they started to think that they could help other people do other things. And around the early 1900s, the early 19th century, should I say, not 1900s, the early 1800s, there was a big debate going on about the North and South, about slavery. There was always the perennial thing about banning alcohol. Temperance societies were everywhere. And what happened in the Oxford group is, first of all, it became the wets and the dries. The wets thought, well, okay, so we can't drink, but everybody else, we don't worry about that. And then there were some people in the outfit that wanted alcohol to be banned, and everybody would stop drinking. There were folks who were supporting slavery, and there was folks who wanted to abolish slavery. There was Democrats and Republicans. There was and it just split the whole thing down the middle. At their highest point, in 1840, the Washingtonians numbered approximately 600,000 in the United States. The whole of the United States, 600,000. From nothing, from five or six guys in Baltimore in a very short time, about 10 years. And the population of the United States at that time was only 17 million. So 600,000 is quite a big proportion of the population that actually end up in the Washingtonians. But what happened very soon after that was that because of all the internal stuff going on and the schisms and the separations and the infighting that went on in the Oxford group, within the next 10 years, they disappeared completely. And Bill didn't know about them. Somehow or other, Earl T did. And so Bill set about making some traditions for us to follow. Now, if we look at the forward to the first edition, the forward to the first edition has the roots of some of the traditions, 7 of them. There's this remain anonymous on the first page of the forward to the first edition. We remain anonymous out of fear to start with, but we believe that it's a very important thing now. Then that we like it understood, the alcoholic work is our vocation. We do it for fun and for free. We don't get paid. It's a hobby, if you like. Then we got tradition 11 on that page. When we go over to the next page, the last page of the forward to the first edition, we have tradition 9, which says we're not an organization in the conventional sense of the word. There are no fees or dues whatsoever. Tradition 7, The only requirement for membership is an honest desire to stop drinking. That would be tradition 3. We are not allied with any particular faith, sect, or denomination, nor do we oppose anyone. Tradition 6. And then finally, simply wish to be helpful to those who are afflicted. That will turn into tradition 5. So he's already got an idea from that they had this idea in the very beginning of Alcoholics Anonymous when they were writing the book. They had this idea about how they should behave within this fellowship that they were building up. And we must remember that the fellowship that we have today, Alcoholics Anonymous, is named after this book. But we mustn't ever forget that. We mustn't ever forget that we come from this book, that we were nothing till this book was published, and that the name Alcoholics Anonymous for the fellowship comes from the book, and we are the fellowship of the book. This book. As we discovered principles by which the individual alcoholic could live, that is, not die, the 12 steps, so we had to evolve principles by which the AA groups and AA as a whole could survive and function effectively. It was thought that no alcoholic man and woman could be excluded from our society. Notice it says alcoholic man and women. Now, it doesn't say that in the third tradition on the wall in Alcoholics Anonymous. If you read the tradition on the wall, it says the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. But if you read the first sentence of the long form of the tradition, which is in the back of the book, it says, we believe our society ought to include all who suffer from alcoholism. Now, I don't find that a problem because there's a sign on the door that says Alcoholics Anonymous. So when I walk into a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, I expect to find alcoholics. That is not always so in my experience. That our leaders might serve or never govern. We've got no bosses in AA. There's no one governs Alcoholics Anonymous except this power greater than ourselves. That each group was to be autonomous. Each group is an entity to itself. There was to be no professional class of therapy. No, we don't therapize anybody. We take them through the 12 steps. That's not therapy. It's nothing like therapy. There are no fees or dues. Our expenses were to be met by our own voluntary contributions. We stay poor. There was to be the least possible organization, even in our service centers. And if you go to the General Service Office of Alcoholics Anonymous, both in New York or in Old York, in the UK or wherever, you will find that the people in that building will be changing jobs every couple of years so they can do every job in the place. They don't stick to they don't stay, they move around, they rotate. Our public relations were to be based on attraction rather than promotion. We don't promote Alcoholics Anonymous. But whenever we speak outside of Alcoholics Anonymous, as members of Alcoholics Anonymous, we need to be attractive. When we go on a 12-step call, we need to look like a recovered alcoholic. I was always very, very impressed by my first sponsor, Billy, when he showed up on a 12-step call. He looked smart. He's a working man, and he normally worked in a one-piece overall, driving a truck. But he showed up in a jacket and slacks with a big book under his arm, smiling with his eyes twinkling. And he looked like he was a recovered alcoholic. And I always carried that with me. I go on a 12-step call, look like a recovered alcoholic. Because I was so different from him. I was sitting there, I was a mess. I was sitting there sitting, shaking, sweating and puking. And he was sitting there shiny and smiling, going, hey, how you doing? How's it working for you? It was decided that all members ought to be anonymous at the level of press, radio and films, TV and films, and I would suggest the internet, though that's not here. But Dr. Bob always said that if you were anonymous below the level of press, radio and films, that you were breaking that tradition. I'm not anonymous in Alcoholics Anonymous. Every meeting I go to, I announce my full name. My name is Peter Misson. I am a recovered alcoholic. I don't always say recovered in various meetings. I do in my home group. because they understand. Some people don't understand the word recovered in Alcoholics Anonymous. They just don't understand it. Oh, you'll never be recovered. Okay, fine. So I don't do that. I don't cause controversy in other people's groups, because their common welfare comes first. I'm very happy in my own group and in other big book groups to call myself a recovered alcoholic. That's fine. But I don't go big book thumping into other meetings I go to, because it's not what I do. It's not what we do. I know there's some folks out there that listen to some people sharing on tape and then go into a meeting and start to be a clone of one particular person in particular. And it alienates so many people from the big book. You have no idea. I'm fighting that for the last 15 years. This guy whose name begins with a C and his second name begins with an R says that there is only one room for one of him in the Alcoholics Anonymous. So please don't listen to what he says and then try it on a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. It causes controversy and it causes division in Alcoholics Anonymous. I love the guy. I know him very, very well. He's actually toned down a great deal in the last few years. He doesn't froth at the mouth quite as much as he used to. But it's important that we do this. When we go talk in another group, in a group that's not a big book group, I do it quite often. We are sensitive to their, we share our experience of working the 12 steps and our experience of alcoholism, but we do it in a way which is attractive, and we're not telling them they don't know how to do it. Very important. Very, very, very important, particularly for the growth of the big book, the regrowth of the big book in Alcoholics Anonymous. Because when we're talking about here, when these traditions were written, nobody was using anything else other than the big book in Alcoholics Anonymous. And the first tradition, and I go back to this, the first tradition right at the back of the book, it says, each member of Alcoholics Anonymous is but a small part of a great whole. AA must continue to live, or most of us will surely die. AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, I believe that there has two meanings in that tradition. First of all, yes, the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, the group of Alcoholics Anonymous, but also the book Alcoholics Anonymous. There's two guys that kept talking about the book in the 1950s and the 1960s and into the 1970s, guys called Joe and Charlie. Now, why do you think they called their talks and their workshops, The Big Book Comes Alive? Because by that time, the book was dead in Alcoholics Anonymous. We'd gone away from it. And they started to bring in the book again back into Alcoholics Anonymous. Bless them. I heard them talking about that when I first got to Alcoholics Anonymous all those years ago. And I went, wow, there's more here. There's more. There's more than just sitting in meetings and not drinking one day at a time. There's more here. So, and in no circumstances should we endorse, make alliances, or enter public controversies. No, we have no opinion. This is the substance of AA's 12 traditions, which are stated in full on page 561 of this book. You can see the short form of the traditions in almost every meeting you go to. That's fine, but if you want to really understand the traditions, read the long form, which is in the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous, on, I think it's 562, 563. No, 563 inside 564. And if you're fired up enough, then go and read the book called AA Comes of Age. Wonderful. It's a history. It's all about this history stuff. It's all about whatever. Wonderful book. And it's in 3 parts. It's in the 3 legacies. It's in the 3 legacies of Alcoholics Anonymous: recovery, unity, and service. 3 parts of the triangle. And the book is divided up into those things. And the middle section, the traditions, is fabulous. Though none of these principles had force of rules or laws, they become so widely accepted in 1950 that they were confirmed at our first international conference held in Cleveland. Today, the remarkable unity of AA is one of the greatest assets our society has. And it's up to us individuals to preserve that unity. While the internal difficulties of adolescent period were being ironed out, public acceptance of AA grew leaps and bounds. For there were two principal reasons: the large number of recoveries, better than anything that Dr. Silkworth could do, particularly as most of the alcoholics that Silkworth passed on to Bill and the early members of Alcoholics Anonymous in New York were the ones that he couldn't help, and reunited homes. These made their impressions everywhere of Alcoholics Anonymous, alcoholics who came to AA and really tried. That means work in the 12 steps. 50% got sober at once and remained that way. 25% sobered after some relapses. Dr. Bob was a relapser. Dr. Bob relapsed. Bill didn't. Dr. Bob did. Sometimes we need it. Sometimes we need to be reminded about how bad this is. And among the remainder who stayed on with AA showed improvement, whatever that means. Now, that's Alcoholics Anonymous writing those numbers. And so people say, oh, yeah, but this Alcoholics Anonymous writing those numbers. That's okay. We can go to the back of the big book and we can go to, I think it's the third appendix. It's on page 569. A medical view on Alcoholics Anonymous. And the third paragraph is by a doctor called Dr. G. Kirby Collier, psychiatrist. And he went to New York. He was one of the doctors that was sent a mimeograph copy of the big book before it was published. Because he was in New York. He was in the state of New York, upstate New York. And he came into New York and talked to Bill and went away and gathered together his alcoholic patients that he couldn't help and said, see this is a book called Alcoholics Anonymous. Or this is going to be a book called Alcoholics Anonymous. It tells you how to get sober and stay sober. Read it, follow what it says. It's up to you. And he just left it there and said, right, you do it. Because this was his strategy. He wasn't an alcoholic, so he couldn't lead these people. But the book was written by alcoholics and said, I felt that AA is a group unto themselves, and that their best results can be had under their own guidance, not his as a psychiatrist, but under AA's guidance, which was in the book. As a result of their philosophy, which is the 12 steps, any therapeutic or philosophic procedure which can prove a recovery rate of 50 to 60% must merit our consideration. Okay, so an independent doctor is saying pretty much the same, maybe 10% less, but pretty much the same as the forward to the second edition. Okay, it's in Alcoholics Anonymous, and he was a friend of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he may well have been a trustee in the early days of AA. However, he was an independent. And I like independent confirmation of numbers. They can get very misleading. Somebody once said, about there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. And so we have to be very careful about statistics. So it says there wasn't it, and a few first decided they didn't want the program, but great numbers of these, about 2 out of 3, began to return as time passed. Once they'd had all the fun they can stand, they couldn't stand it anymore. Okay, 5 minutes to go. I'll finish this up. Okay, another reason was the wide acceptance of AA was administration of friends in medicine, religion, and the press, together with innumerable others who became able and persistent advocates. And these are people not alcoholics. These are people in other walks of life. They're not alcoholics. These are people who are our friends that can see what is happening here. Now, I don't believe that our success rate is anything like 50 to 60% now in Alcoholics Anonymous. I really don't believe that. Our own statistics said in the decade 1990 to 2000 that we actually got smaller. and then it stays static in the next decade. I don't know what it is for this past decade. 2000, 2010, it stayed platform. It was plateauing. So, without such support, AA could have made only slowest progress. Some of the recommendations of AA's early medical and religious friends can be found further on in this book, in the appendices. Alcoholics Anonymous is not a religious organization. Absolutely not. Neither does AA take any particular medical point of view. Absolutely not. We're not doctors. Though we cooperate widely with the men of medicine as well as the men of religion, we cooperate, but we don't criticize or agree. Alcohol being no respecter of persons, we are an accurate cross-section of America, and in distant lands, the same democratic evening up process is now going on. By personal religious affiliation, we include Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Hindus, and a sprinkling of Muslims and Buddhists. More than 15% of us are women in 1955. At present, our membership is pyramiding at the rate of about 20% per year. That's going to slow down. So far, upon the total problem of several million actual or potential alcoholics in the world, more than that, we've made only a scratch in all probability. We shall never be able to touch more than a fair fraction of the alcohol problem in all its ramifications. Upon therapy for the alcoholic himself, we surely have no monopoly. See, we're not saying we're the only house on the block. We just like the really sick ones. We like the sick ones that can't get it anywhere else. We like the ones who have tried everything else. And we're the last house on the block. Because then they'll be ready to do what we do. Because you've got to be ready, you know. You can't just come to AA and say, oh, yeah, I think I'll work the 12 steps. No, you've got to be ready to do it. You've got to do it with your heart, not your head. It sometimes takes a long time. I did it with my head to start with, you know. When I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, I did it with my head. And I didn't really do it with my heart. Then about 16 years into sobriety, I almost drank. And then I did it with my heart because I didn't want to die at 16 years sober. I almost did. Upon therapy, the alcoholic itself, we have surely no monopoly. Here we are saying we're very humble. We're not the only answer. What we have is something that worked for us. Now, we hope it will work for you. If we pass on what we have done, it may work for you. But we don't say we're the only one on the block. We're the only one that does this. Yet it is our great hope. People who wrote this book, people who are writing this forward in 1955. Our great hope is that all who have yet found no answer to alcoholism may begin to find one in the pages of this book and will presently join us on the high road to a new freedom. And Bill passed away in 1971, so there was a third edition. Now, just before I finish, if we look at the forward to the first edition, it says, "We of Alcoholics Anonymous." And it talks about 100. We are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. If we go to the forward to the second edition, it says about 10 lines, 15 lines, 10, 12 lines down from the top, in brief space, Alcoholics Anonymous has mushroomed nearly 6,000 groups whose membership is far above 150,000 recovered alcoholics. Now, what is interesting about the next two forwards, which I will skim through next week because there's nothing much there except the numbers. In 16 years, Alcoholics Anonymous came from 100 to 150,000. That is multiplying 100 by 15,000 in 16 years. In the forward to the 21 years later, the forward to the third edition, the numbers are now 1 million. That is multiplying 150,000 by 7. Our growth has slowed down enormously in those years between 1955 and 1976. I wonder why. By the time we get to the fourth edition, it's only doubled in 25 years. The numbers have just doubled in 25 years. So in between 1976 and 2001, our growth has become very small indeed, compared with the growth of the early days of Alcoholics Anonymous. I wonder why that is. I'll let you figure that one out for next week. I'm going to stop this now.